Should the United States increase its investment in nuclear energy? This is the most well-researched, in-depth lecture on this topic that you'll find anywhere on the internet. I've read hundreds of pages of research to bring you the strongest arguments and most robust research, all available as cut debate cards at debatetrack.com. Purchasing this brief also gets you access to exclusive rebuttal sheets, dedicated impact briefs, and directly supports free, accessible debate content. To all my supporters, thank you. And to everyone watching, welcome to Debate Track. We'll begin with topic background, followed by affirmative, which is arguments for nuclear energy investment, then negative, which is arguments against nuclear energy investment. A reminder, quotes in this lecture are edited for clarity and brevity. They're not read verbatim. This is the same as in debate rounds. Here is your topic. The US federal government should substantially increase its investment in domestic nuclear energy. Let's break down this resolution one by one. This month, as with most, we talk about the federal government, the folks in DC making national policies, not individual states or local governments. This must be action of some kind by Congress, the White House, or a federal agency. The resolution focuses on public or government funding, not private sector investment. So arguments about corporations or philanthropy stepping in are outside the scope for the affirmative team and a good alternative for the negative team to potentially introduce. Substantially is an intentionally vague word that leaves the question open as to what substantial increase might even mean. This leaves you to ask, is funding too low? AF will argue that funding is lacking and an increase is necessary to fix major problems. Is the status quo enough? Neg might argue that current funding levels, while good, are already sufficient and don't need a boost. Or is funding too much already? Neg might also claim that current spending is already too high and that further increases would be wasteful or even harmful. Investment, for the most part, means money. There's many things the US federal government could do to support nuclear industry, but investments by the government means building with Benjamins. This might mean building nuclear plants, buying nuclear energy, or funding nuclear research. However, the government can encourage the nuclear industry through other means as well, passing laws, regulations, and frameworks that shape investment from private industry. However, these actions should not be confused with investment. Finally, domestic. This means the investment must stay within US borders. This excludes foreign aid or international programs and exports or overseas business. Although, fueling domestic exports could be an advantage to bolstering the domestic industry. A downstream impact of the government's financial investment might mean the industry grows, and then we can find international customers for our nuclear power projects. What does nuclear energy use and energy in general look like right now in the United States? The US uses about 16% of global energy, significantly above average as the US only holds 4.2% of the global population. Both domestic and global energy use continues to grow, as the global population and global consumption grow in tandem. However, in some areas the US is running out of electricity. These mostly regional shortages are largely driven by increases in data centers, and especially of AI data centers. Halper 324 talks about that at length. This trend is already driving up costs for Americans in some parts of the country. That's Halper and O'Donovan. While some are calling this data center-driven electricity crunch a crisis, some see it as propaganda, a push by big oil to produce more oil and gas. Quote from Wong25, both Trump and the oil and gas industry, which donated tens of millions to his presidential campaign, seem to have recognized an opportunity in the panic. The American Petroleum Institute has repeatedly stressed that natural gas will be crucial in powering the AI revolution. Now the doors are open. The US is not actually in an energy crunch. There is no explosive electricity demand at the national level. Rather than necessitating a fossil fuel build-out, AI seems more to be a convenient excuse for Trump to pursue one. End quote. And now, a note on the grid. The US power grid is a vast, interconnected network that delivers electricity across the country, but much of the infrastructure is aging and struggling to keep up with modern demands. Built primarily in the mid-20th century, many components such as transformers, substations, and transmission lines are reaching the end of their intended lifespan, leading to increased blackouts, maintenance costs, and vulnerabilities to extreme weather and cyber attacks. Recognizing these challenges, the federal government has ramped up investments with initiatives like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, allocating billions to upgrade the grid, improve energy resilience, and integrate renewable sources. Now, the energy mix within the US. 9% of our energy use is nuclear. Thus, nuclear represents 50% of the US's clean energy production. That's according to EIA 724. Here's that graph a little bit bigger. You can see the vast majority of energy is hydrocarbons between petroleum, natural gas, and coal. And renewables and nuclear are about the same at around 9% of electricity production, although the renewables is a little bit higher than nuclear at this point. I'm sorry, this is energy production, not electricity. Nuclear also represents 20% of electricity generation. These different numbers, energy versus electricity, are due to the fact that much energy is never converted to electricity before use. For example, burning gasoline in an engine produces mechanical energy, burning gas on a stove produces heat energy, and burning fuel in a rocket produces thrust. None of these are converted to electricity before use, but all of them are forms of energy production. Next, let's take a look at some of the main technologies and considerations around nuclear energy itself. Traditional nuclear reactors are based on nuclear fission, the splitting apart of atoms to release enormous amounts of energy. They have been in use since the first nuclear power station was connected to the grid in 1954 in Obninsk, Soviet Union. A look at reactor anatomy. The core is the heart of a nuclear reactor, containing the nuclear fuel, usually uranium or plutonium, and control mechanisms that regulate the fission reaction. It generates intense heat through nuclear fission, which must be efficiently transferred away from the core to prevent overheating and to maintain stable energy production. This heat, created through nuclear fission in the core, is used to boil water, with the steam driving turbines connected to generators, which convert the energy into electrical power available for use on the grid. Cooling systems are essential to regulate reactor temperatures and prevent meltdowns. Three primary cooling methods that are used are once-through or single-pass cooling, where a plant is built near a lake, river, or ocean, and the cold water is continuously pumped into the plant, used for cooling, and then pumped back into the body of water. There are environmental concerns to this thermal pollution, as pumping a bunch of hot water into a river or lake disturbs the fishies. 2. Closed-loop cooling is where the water is recycled and cooled using large cooling towers. These are the hyperboloid structures characteristic of nuclear plants. When you think of a nuclear plant, these cooling structures, that's what most people really think of. And third, air cooling, where radiators use air to dissipate heat. These systems are more aesthetic if you don't want huge nuclear towers in your community, and they don't use water, which is a plus, but they're less efficient than water-based cooling systems. Control systems provide the mechanisms to keep nuclear reactions stable, and prevent runaway reactions, and manage the efficiency and output of power plants. These systems include control rods, which slow or stop the fission reactions, and coolant flows, which manage temperatures. The final part of reactor's anatomy is the containment systems, the last line of defense in a reactor. These systems are designed to prevent radiation leaks and to protect the environment in case of accidents. These systems are usually shells of reinforced concrete and steel, encasing the reactor core and other components. Modern reactors use double containment domes and negative pressure systems to ensure that if anything goes wrong, nothing will get out. A brief look at history, I suppose. Nuclear reactor technology has gone through 4 generations of development. First generation reactors, built in the 50s and 60s, were used primarily for research and very early power generation. They used only slightly enhanced fuel, meaning power generation was inefficient, and they lacked containment structures, making them vulnerable to accidents. Second generation reactors improved on the limitations of these Gen 1 reactors, including using enriched uranium, stronger containment structures to prevent radiation leaks, and core cooling to mitigate meltdowns. They also had longer lifespans, up to 60 years, and represent most of the reactors in use today. However, given improvements, no new second generation reactors are being built. Third-generation reactors even further improved on the efficiency and safety systems, especially after the Chernobyl disaster and Fukushima disaster. Improvements include passive safety systems, so that even if external power is cut, the reactors can remain stable. The default is they will fail safe. The most notable example is in the US is the AP1000 from Westinghouse, design used in the recent Vogtle Unit 3 and Unit 4 builds in Georgia. Fourth-generation reactors aim to add even further improvements to the ongoing issues of size, cost, complexity, nuclear waste, proliferation. These include molten salt reactors, small modular reactors, and other experimental technologies. However, given that these technologies are evolving and are still being tested, it's unclear which of these disparate technologies will emerge as the go-to solution for the future of nuclear. Now let's talk ever so briefly about some of these advanced fourth-gen technologies, as you're likely to see some of them crop up in your debate rounds. You might even see them come up in your own case. Small modular reactors are the most likely to come up, as these are actually in development and in use in a few cases around the world. The American company NuScale has an SMR design that's been approved for use in the United States, which is currently looking for its first customer. SMRs are compact reactors designed for flexibility and scalability, and they can theoretically be mass-produced in factories and deployed in remote areas or integrated into grids. The nuclear engines found in nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers are essentially SMRs, with compact sizes, long operational lifespans, and self-sustaining off-grid capabilities. An aircraft carrier engine might generate about 200 megawatts. For reference, a modern nuclear power plant is about 1,000 megawatts, so a sort of city-sized nuclear power plant is only 5 times bigger than these aircraft carrier engines. Obviously, an aircraft carrier is essentially a small town. Microreactors, a subset of SMRs, are even smaller and are designed for military bases, remote communities, or space missions. Molten salt reactors use molten salt as both a coolant and a fuel carrier, eliminating meltdown risks, theoretically. They can operate at higher temperatures than normal reactors for greater efficiency. For some reason, this is the case. The higher the temperature, the more efficient the reactor is. China's experimental TMSR is the first of its kind to be tested, pictured here. Fast breeder reactors breed or create more fuel than they consume by converting uranium-238 into plutonium-239. Although these reactors could extend global uranium supplies by an order of magnitude, they are more complex and expensive to build than traditional reactors. Russia's BN800 reactor is one operational fast reactor currently in use, also pictured here. Thorium reactors use thorium-232 instead of uranium and can be integrated into molten salt reactors. This fuel source is more abundant than uranium, produces less nuclear waste, and is less weaponizable. India is a leader in thorium R&D with a long-term goal to shift towards thorium reactors. Unlike fission, fusion combines hydrogen atoms to release energy, much like stars do. Instead of uranium, fusion reactors use deuterium and tritium, which are just versions of hydrogen, so very commonly available as a fuel, and they produce helium as waste. Fusion is really the holy grail of nuclear technology, promising, again theoretically, to deliver free energy or nearly free energy while solving issues like waste and proliferation. And the only thing we would be proliferating here is the helium. That's it, that's the waste. ITER, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, in France is the world's largest fusion project, but there are none that are commercially viable at this point. There are ongoing challenges to make fusion work, not least of which is the fact that plasma in fusion reactors is heated to hundreds of millions of degrees, many times hotter than the sun. Now, personally, I think that's way too hot, but apparently these nuclear scientists working on the project think they know more than me, so that's what they're doing. In any case, making components that can deal with this kind of extreme heat is difficult. In fact, I've read that one of the propositions for containing this plasma is to use molten metal, liquid metal, to build the walls of the reactor. If that boggles your mind, unfortunately it probably boggles the engineers' minds too. How would you make a reactor like this with liquid metal walls? Now, I'm not going through all of these just to geek out on nuclear technology, although I kind of am geeking out. Any of the technologies here could be argued to be profitable avenues for the US federal government to increase investment towards. so knowing a little bit about them, including their shortcomings and disadvantages, will be very helpful in debate rounds. Nuclear energy is used in two forms: electricity, produced through steam generators, and process heat, which can be directly applied to industrial applications without being converted into electricity first. So, first, electricity. Again, nuclear reactors generate about 20% of the US's electricity. Unlike oil and gas, this electricity is carbon-free. Unlike renewables like solar and wind, nuclear provides a stable base power for the grid. It works regardless of the wind blowing and the sun shining. Nuclear reactors produce a lot of heat. Advanced reactors, which operate at higher, more efficient temperatures, produce even more heat. Both can be used for process heat applications, using the heat without turning it into electricity. Amongst uses for process heat are district heating. This is heating homes and businesses in an area with steam. Desalination, turning seawater into drinking water. Petrochemical refining. And industrial production for things like hydrogen, fertilizer, and steel and cement. These things all require a lot of heat, and nuclear power plants produce a lot of heat. Nuclear power is often praised for being clean and efficient, but a large downside remains the nuclear waste it produces. While nuclear plants don't produce CO2 emissions like fossil fuels, they generate radioactive waste, which is highly hazardous and remains dangerous for up to hundreds of thousands of years, at least radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. And exposure to this waste can be deadly, causing cancer, genetic mutations, and organ failure if not properly contained. Water contamination is a major issue. If waste leaks into groundwater, it can cause widespread contamination for centuries. When we think about storing nuclear waste underground, for example, it seems nearly inevitable that over centuries and millennia, it will come into contact with groundwater, as well as be disturbed by earthquakes and plate tectonics, or encounter corrosion of storage containers over time. Again, we're talking hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of years. It's just a long time to be able to say, hey, this waste will stay secure. What's more, no country has a fully operational, permanent disposal site for high-level waste. Most nuclear waste is kept in temporary storage pools or dry casks, which are only designed to last 50 to 100 years. Again, many nuclear isotopes can remain dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. So storage containers that outlast our lives, and indeed our civilization, are crucial. The collapse of our modern world itself should not be enough to put in danger whatever storage solutions we come up with. This makes nuclear waste obviously a little bit tricky to deal with. Yucca Mountain in the US was supposed to be a permanent storage site for US nuclear waste, but political and environmental concerns halted the project, so we have nowhere to put it. What this all means is that as nuclear plants continue operating, nuclear waste, again toxic for thousands of years, continues to pile up at temporary storage sites across the country. Now, it's worth mentioning the most famous nuclear accidents, which you'll hear across this topic: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. All of them entail meltdowns, where the nuclear chain reactions that power a reactor's core can't be adequately stopped, and then cooling systems fail, and then the resulting heat and steam and radioactivity create some kind of issues. So, 3 Mile Island was a partial meltdown of Reactor 2 at the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station in Pennsylvania, leading to widespread fear and regulatory changes. This was the largest nuclear accident in US history and resulted in, when we total the immediate deaths plus the subsequent deaths from cancer, exactly 0 deaths, in addition to 0 injuries. Again, this is the largest nuclear accident ever in the United States. Chernobyl was a catastrophic explosion at Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the USSR, modern-day Ukraine, which led to widespread radioactive contamination, long-term health effects, and the permanent abandonment of the nearby city of Pripyat. This accident led to hundreds of deaths in the immediate aftermath and in subsequent decades from radiation-linked cancer. Not hundreds, about 100 total, making it by far the most deadly nuclear accident in history. It also spurned the 2019 TV show Chernobyl, certainly the best historical drama I've ever seen, and in my personal ratings, the best TV show of 2019. Here is the famous elephant foot photo, an actual photo taken with mirrors of part of the melted core of the Chernobyl plant. And last, Fukushima, 2011 Japan. A tsunami triggered by a massive earthquake caused cooling system failures at the Fukushima plant, leading to core meltdowns, radiation leaks, and a large-scale evacuation. It's worth noting a couple things. First, this was an old Generation 2 reactor without the modern safety features of Generation 3 and 4 reactors. It did not have, for example, passive or fail-safe systems. And it was caused by the most powerful earthquake ever measured in Japan, a magnitude 9.0, the fourth most powerful earthquake ever recorded by humanity since we began measuring them in 1900-ish. So, all told, not great, not terrible. These are the three most famous nuclear accidents in history. If the dual dangers, however, of waste, nuclear waste, and meltdowns give you second thoughts about nuclear as an energy source, consider the relative risks of burning oil and gas, which create air pollution and global warming. Here is Salmon 19, quote, "While the waste may be dangerous and the risks associated with meltdowns cinematically seared into our collective memory, the technology is actually safer than burning fossil fuels. One study found that per unit of electricity generated, oil is 263 times more deadly than nuclear on account of air pollution alone." Only on account of air pollution. So, air pollution is a less sexy topic for a historical documentary, but it's way more deadly. Finally, let's look at the nuclear energy leaderboard and this graph from Visual Capitalist. The US is currently in the lead in operating nuclear capacity, followed by France, then China, then Russia. However, as the graph implies, China will soon become the world's leader, with most estimates marking 2030 as the year China pulls into the lead. France, being in the current number 2 spot, is impressive given its size. Fully 64% of France's energy is nuclear, making it the most nuclear-powered country on the planet. Nuclear power plants are wildly expensive to build compared to other power projects. However, they also generate wildly more energy than other plants. On balance, nuclear energy is competitive with other forms of energy over its lifetime, but extremely front-loaded in terms of getting the project started. I should note that direct comparisons of cost are made difficult by subsidies, short-term energy markets, variable per megawatt cost of all forms of electricity. Essentially, some projects cost way more than others due to market forces, cost overruns, technology used, and other factors. What this means for you is that you can find pretty good evidence that says nuclear is way more expensive than renewables, pretty good evidence that says it's about the same price, and pretty good evidence that says it's cheaper. It's just pretty hard to compare. You could probably find a real answer to this, but it would take a lot of deep digging throughout the numbers, which I have not done. So, nuclear power projects, or NPPs, are extremely expensive to build, again, for a few reasons. First, complex engineering and safety requirements, strict regulatory approval processes, and long construction times, which can last from 5 to 15 years. This is the case for traditional Gen 2 and Gen 3 reactors, but non-traditional reactors are even more expensive. FOAK, or first-of-a-kind projects, are especially expensive, as design and components all need to be constructed from scratch. These are essentially prototypes. Manufacturing and construction processes may be unknown or incomplete, leading to frequent cost overruns and projects taking much longer than expected. This applies to any advanced reactor projects, including SMRs. Again, even more expensive. One-off plant projects are also expensive, as supply chains, project management experience, and skilled workforces can't be scaled in the same way successive projects might be. Vogtle Unit 3 and 4, finished in 2023 and 2024, might be a two-off project. Better cost efficiency than a single reactor for sure, but still less than ordering 5 or 10 reactors at a time. Decommissioning is another cost. When a power plant reaches the end of its lifetime, there are large costs associated with deconstruction and disposal of radioactive power plants. This costs hundreds of millions of dollars. However, once operational, NPPs have a much lower cost than any other form of electricity. They also consistently produce enormous amounts of energy to the degree that they can catch up with the prices of renewables over their decades-long lifetimes. Fanto 19 argues, quote, "Although nuclear power plants can take several years to build, they produce more electricity per plant than renewable technologies and thus can quickly catch up with faster construction of less powerful renewable technologies. The speed at which nuclear power adds emissions-free technology or electricity makes it a critical technology for eliminating carbon emissions as quickly as possible." End quote. Two of the most simple ways to reduce nuclear costs at a federal level is serial development and standardized designs. In serial development, an order book of multiple NPPs, say 5 or 10, is put into contractors instead of a single order. This gives each project a better price, as all components can be purchased in bulk. It's not like shopping at Costco, but still, 4 of these cooling towers is probably better than 1. It also lets subsequent projects benefit from the project management and construction experience of first projects. Using standardized designs is also huge. Washington Post 24 from their editorial board, quote, "The enormous expense of the 20th century nuclear deployment in the US was largely because builders used more than 50 unique reactor designs. Other countries with more standardized models built out nuclear energy much more cheaply," end quote. Other factors also contribute to lower cost. China, for example, has the world's most robust industry in all things construction, so construction of nuclear power plants is just easier for them. They have more experience, a bigger, more skilled workforce, and better supply chains. Their lower cost of labor also leads to lower cost for construction projects, including nuclear. With these factors in mind, nuclear plants in other countries can cost 1/3 to 1/2 the cost of US construction. Russia and China also have lower safety standards, or so I've read. Remember, they're the bad guys, so of course they have lower safety standards than the US, and lowering safety standards certainly does make things cheaper. A final component of nuclear project costs is externalities, social and tangential costs that aren't formally weighted into the dollar amounts spent on nuclear and other projects. The main positive externalities are a lack of emissions, besides steam pictured here, and highly reliable energy. How do you price the carbon emissions from burning gas or oil, or the benefit to society of having an always-on, consistent energy supply that lasts uninterrupted for decades? The Nuclear Innovation Alliance 24 quote the following analogy on why looking at a dollar price isn't enough. Quote, "Imagine you are standing in Manhattan and want to get to London in the most cost-effective way. We would find that swimming is the cheapest. By the cost per mile of swimming, it is far easier than building a boat, and the infrastructure needed to use a plane would be very expensive. Swimming is clearly the cheapest way to get to London. Furthermore, you can have a reasoned debate with the top experts in ocean crossing, and you can all agree that you are using the same metric. Of course, none of you have any plans on swimming there. After all, it's not physically possible. That doesn't stop experts from advocating that other people be required by government mandate to swim because it's cheap." End quote. There are also negative externalities, namely waste storage, disposal, and risk of accidents. Waste is a problem that future generations and future taxpayers will have to deal with. How can we price in the concern of future generations when considering our energy use? Talking about our domestic industry right now, the US was the birthplace of the nuclear bomb and the birthplace of nuclear energy. Its buildup and experience with nuclear power in the 60s and 70s made it a world leader in innovation, design, and construction. But after the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, US nuclear construction all but halted. This has caused the entire industry, including talent and supply chains, to wither. Although we recently constructed a project in Georgia, no new large-scale reactors are in construction. TJ Nordquist sees this as a missed opportunity to revamp the domestic industry. Quote, "Now is the time to double down on US nuclear development and leverage a domestic workforce that has recently absorbed the know-how of nuclear reactor construction from Vogtle, what economists call diffusion of knowledge. The longer the US waits to construct a reactor, the more it risks a brain drain. Some 14,000 workers, including engineers, welders, masons, electricians, mechanics, and support staff, helped to construct the Vogtle plant and could be deployed to build another AP1000 as quickly as possible to keep domestic know-how alive and to maintain nuclear power momentum." End quote. So, maybe we want to build more reactors, but how much do they cost exactly? And who might pay for them? Nuclear power plants are huge investments, costing between 5 and 10 billion, and with large-scale projects often exceeding these numbers. The Vogtle plant, I believe it was for both reactors, I think it was nearly 40 billion. So something like 20 billion apiece. Don't quote me on that. Investors must be willing to wait decades for returns, as nuclear plants take 5 to 15 years to build before operating for 60 plus years. Given the future energy needs, contributions from renewables, and prices of other energy sources can only be guessed at, investors are not generally willing to put money into such a project. There are exceptions. Next-generation nuclear, like SMRs, are attracting new investment as governments and companies look for low-carbon energy solutions. These reactors also promise to solve the long time frames and high cost of traditional reactors, making these projects more appealing to investors. And US investors are testing the waters, led by Google, Microsoft, AWS, and tech companies with increasingly energy-hungry data centers, alongside industry players like Nucor, a green steel energy producer. Here's K25 quote, "Tech companies are investing substantial amounts of capital into data centers and clean energy procurement. Constellation Energy announced a 20-year power purchase agreement with Microsoft to restart 3 Mile Island Unit 1 in Pennsylvania. Green Energy Partners intends to build a data center campus adjacent to Dominion Energy's Surrey nuclear power plant. Google, Microsoft, and Nucor announced memorandums of understanding with Duke Energy to enable investments in advanced nuclear energy in North Carolina." End quote. Because finding investors for nuclear projects is so difficult, some see government funding as crucial. The government can fund public goods, which give the public benefits like a steady electricity supply and low carbon outputs, without a guarantee of monetary return on investment. Same way the government can make national parks, right? Or local governments can make city parks. That doesn't make anyone any money. It's just a good thing for us all to have. Governments, including the US, have historically helped to build domestic nuclear industries. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, for example, provides $30 billion in tax credits for nuclear energy projects. Again, one of the main ways the government can support nuclear projects is through regulation. The Advanced Act of 2024, for example, lowered barriers to advanced nuclear technology by speeding up the licensing process, reducing application fees for DOE projects, and enhancing international collaboration on nuclear projects. Public-private partnerships, or PPPs, are the middle path options the Buddha would have picked if he advised on nuclear policy. Of course, AF cannot advocate for these. AF argues for public funding only, and NEG can't advocate for these either, as they argue against public funding only. However, AF could make the case that increased government investment leads to more private investment, and this is likely the case, especially if government research leads to advances in cutting-edge nuclear tech. Finally, some big picture notes on strategy. First, it's been a crazy couple of months of Mr. the Donald. Arguments that rely on Russia being our enemy now have open questions about them. Federal funding, meanwhile, of anything seems tenuous. I'm not entirely sure what American leadership can or should mean at this point. Things are in flux. This creates a great many opportunities for teams that can process current events well and incorporate them into their debate rounds. Let's talk about AF. At first glance, this topic seems pretty AF biased. The case for nuclear is just too easy to make, and the disadvantages are too slim. As is common, there's way more AF evidence than neg evidence in the brief. In addition, many of the disadvantages that neg might present could just be reasons for more funding. We have issues storing waste, for example. Okay, no problem. More government investment solves. Or advanced reactors aren't viable yet. More investment solves. However, the specificity of the resolution means that AF has a narrow needle to thread. They're not advocating for the benefits of nuclear in general. Instead, AF must do the following. Status quo. Establish that there is some problem in the world. Have a solution. Nuclear. Establish nuclear as the solution to that problem. But again, establish that the status quo of nuclear itself is insufficient. Investment. Establish that investment, rather than regulation, is the way to solve the status quo of nuclear. And then, specifically public investment. Establish that government investment, not private investment, is the mechanism that should be used to accomplish this. So AF has a heavy lift, and NEG has many avenues of attack. Of course, this all applies only if the judge is keeping track of all of this. More technical rounds may prove to be more difficult for AF teams, whereas lay rounds will probably remain AF biased. Again, at first glance, NEG does not have tons to work with. Waste and safety just don't have that much of an impact. Cost, time, money, opportunity are all big points against nuclear, but they might not stand up to even moderate amounts of weighing when you consider what the AF has going for them. However, again, NEG will be presented with many opportunities for defense. In a technical round, NEG can do any of the following to win a round, with minimal offense on their side. case status quo establish there's no problem to be solved, i.e. they say we need more energy for AI, you can say no, there's no issue with AI energy in the status quo. Talk about the nuclear status quo. See, there's already sufficient nuclear. After all, 20% of electricity production is kind of a lot. No solvency. Nuclear energy is not the solution to the stated problem. Or alternatives. Illustrate that renewables are better than nuclear, private investment is better than public, or that regulations are better than investment, without triggering negatives nominal DAs. Now, none of these should be run as counterplans, of course, but all of them might be reasons to reject the affirmative's claims. Again, I predict neg to have an advantage in technical rounds where the judge can keep track of all of this that's going on, and a disadvantage in rhetoric-heavy rounds where this level of specificity gets lost. However, I'm not a debater, I just make YouTube lectures, so I could be wrong. All right, arguments. Let's start with arguments for an increase in nuclear energy investment by the US federal government. Go ahead, turn your page, take out your notes, make a little doodle. Nuclear energy is the cleanest, most robust, and largest scale energy technology available to humanity. Yet America, the birthplace of nuclear technology and the once undisputed world champion innovating, designing, and manufacturing nuclear power plants, has a nuclear industry in decline. Its competitors, meanwhile, are pulling into the lead. While the US remains in the lead numbers-wise with 93 reactors, China already has 55 operational reactors and more than 20 under various stages of construction. The US, meanwhile, has 0 under construction. Of course, while the majority of China's reactors are new in nuclear terms, the US's fleet is aging, with 22 of the US's reactors in various stages of decommissioning. With the US in decline and China on the rise, China is expected to overtake the US in nuclear output by 2030. That's Nordquist 24 and Irwin Hunt 24. Two other notable fields China is winning in. First, advanced nuclear tech. Quote, China is leading its development of SMR demonstration projects, including Linglong 1 in Hainan. China is 10 to 15 years ahead of the US in its ability to deploy this latest generation of nuclear reactors at scale. China is the only country now building all 6 of the different types of nuclear reactors, end quote. That's Irwin Hunt 24. And exports. Quote, China also intends to build a total of 150 new nuclear reactors between 2020 and 2035, which includes a target of selling 30 nuclear reactors via its Belt and Road Initiative, end quote. It's Nordquist 24. Russia, meanwhile, has the 4th largest nuclear capacity, but where it truly outshines the US is on its nuclear supply chain and commercial reactor builds. Here is Bone, Gordon, and Simon's 20 quote. While the US was once the undisputed leader in developing new nuclear energy technologies, that leadership has since atrophied. Russia, on the other hand, has become the leading supplier of reactors to other countries in recent decades, end quote. Russia also controls 40% of the world's uranium refinement, leaving the US vulnerable to Russian export controls. This vulnerability particularly applies to HALEU uranium fuel. Irwin Hunt 24. Russian state-owned company Tandex is the world's only commercial supplier of high-assay, low-enriched uranium, HALEU, the fuel needed for most SMRs. Russian and Chinese nuclear dominance should come as no surprise, as both countries' governments have made nuclear capabilities national priorities. To compete against the state backing of these two governments, the US will need to provide similar state backing. Nuclear Innovation Alliance 21, quote, as the US contemplates how it will regain strength in the international nuclear market, it will face serious headwinds because Russia's and China's nuclear industries are state-owned and financed. Government intervention, therefore, is imperative to reviving the domestic nuclear industry, and the support will be felt for generations to come. You see, nuclear power plants can operate from 40 to 60 years, and newer reactors are being built to last for 100. The country that designs and builds these plants will likely also get contracts for maintenance, refueling, decommissioning, meaning that nuclear power suppliers establish century-long relationships with the countries they supply to. This means that as the US cedes nuclear energy influence to Russia and China, it cedes that influence for our children and our grandchildren as well. Here's the US Department of Energy 20 quote, of the 107 new reactors that will be completed around the world by 2030, 43 will be supplied by Chinese vendors, 29 by Russia, 10 by India, 9 by South Korea, and 4 by France. Meanwhile, the performance of the US is alarming. US-based reactor vendors are expected to see only 3 units built by 2030. US commercial vendors have been outcompeted in the export market by state-owned enterprises backed by the full support of governments using nuclear exports as geostrategic national security tools to establish bilateral relations that will last nearly a century from design to decommissioning. End quote. When we think of weighing on timeline, this card will be particularly important. And the number of impacts associated with American nuclear energy leadership is, from our perspective, alarming. Energy security is national security. And to the degree that nuclear is the #1 long-term stable supplier of energy, US dominance is vital to our national security interests. Bowen, Gordon, and Siemens 20 say that, quote, ceding leadership of this energy space to the Chinese and Russians would have negative geopolitical implications for the US, end quote. Simone 24 argues that maintaining nuclear leadership can only be done through government support, which can adequately value public goods, but not private markets, whose main goal is to make money. Quote, when former DOE secretary and nuclear scientist Ernest Moniz says that decline in the US nuclear power sector threatens national security, we should all pay attention. Maintaining the US nuclear power industry is critical to preserving a domestic nuclear supply chain that enables US leadership on nonproliferation, supports the US Navy, sustains nuclear engineering expertise, and empowers national defense actions. But markets definitely cannot value national security. National defense is a public good, not a purchasable private good. Federal taxpayer support for the national security benefits associated with saving a nuclear plant make sense. End quote. So, much like the government should fund parks that we can all appreciate, even though we don't pay for them directly, the government should fund national defense, even though we can't pay for it directly, but all appreciate having national defense. And nuclear is an important piece of this. Next impact is safety. Although nuclear power has an extraordinarily safe track record, we also want to keep it that way. Safety regulations and strict export protocols championed by the US are necessary for spreading nuclear power around the world. In as far as Russia and China dominate the export market and set their eyes on nuclear dominance rather than nuclear safety, the chances of further nuclear accidents increase dramatically. Carlos 20, quote, this shift from US-based reactor suppliers to those in Russia and China, in conjunction with the large-scale deployment of nuclear power plants in nations with very little experience with nuclear power, will lead to increased nuclear security and safety risks, end quote. When Carlos mentions security here, what they're talking about is the next impact, proliferation. Nuclear materials, including, this should be, safety, proliferation. Nuclear materials, including uranium and refinement equipment, are dual use. They can be used for nuclear power or for nuclear weapons. Non-proliferation protocols are therefore important to prevent nuclear materials destined for civilian power generation from falling into the hands of those who want to create a nuclear weapon. Again, American nuclear energy dominance must be maintained to ensure responsible non-proliferation as nuclear energy spreads. Russia and China, who have both helped the nuclear programs of North Korea and Iran, are implicitly pro-proliferation. Their dominance of the nuclear energy space is therefore a danger to us all. Potaman 19 talks about both safety and non-proliferation. Quote, American nuclear leadership has always been critical to guiding the safe, responsible use of civilian nuclear energy around the world. A number of American companies are developing advanced technologies that offer a host of safety and non-proliferation advantages. The US should lead the way in the development of these reactors so they can be deployed at home and abroad over the next decade. End quote. And of course, how could we talk about any topic without mentioning AI? Tech companies will increasingly be powered by nuclear energy. Here's Gordon and Hughes 24. Quote, data center providers and generative AI companies are driving a surge in electricity demand that is only expected to increase. Tech companies have ravenous electricity appetites and require clean, consistent power at the highest levels of reliability for 24/7 operations of their servers and critical cooling equipment. Nuclear energy has attributes uniquely suited to meet these demands. End quote. To help domestic tech companies succeed and provide them the clean, long-term, and massive power supply that they'll need, the government should invest in nuclear. Here's Bordoff and Dunman, 24, quote, "To win the AI race, the next administration should set for itself a grand challenge of building a terawatt of nuclear energy generation capacity in the next decade. Achieving such a goal was already necessary in order for the US to confront the challenge of climate change, but it is now urgently needed to confront the national security and economic imperatives raised by AI." End quote. The downstream impacts are, of course, everything AI: economic, military, geopolitical, societal, and technological influence. Surely these impacts could be a whole lecture in themselves, and surely after last month's topic, you have tons of these impacts ready to go. Olivo 24 talks about how coal plants are being kept online to feed energy-hungry data centers with no domestic nuclear construction available to take their place. Quote, "Massive data centers with computers processing nearly 70% of global digital traffic are gobbling up electricity at a rate officials overseeing the power grid say is unsustainable unless two things happen. Antiquated coal-powered electricity plants that had been scheduled to go offline will need to keep running to fuel the increasing need for more power, undermining clean energy goals. Critics say it will force residents near the coal plants to continue living with toxic pollution." End quote. So even if you don't buy the benefits of AI themselves, even if you think that AI is Satan incarnate, a demon coming to kill us all, the alternative to nuclear-powered AI is coal-powered AI. And certainly, if we're going to have a demon monster from hell kill us, it should be at least clean energy-powered, right? The final impacts, which I'll name as an honorable mention, are jobs and economy. Injecting government money into the nuclear industry will bolster the economy, provide steady energy to industry, and create jobs, both in the nuclear industry and downstream of it. Although jobs are important, especially if you don't have one, and the economy is important to the extent that people can buy the things they need, you'll also get these benefits from filling local swimming pools with dollar bills and telling people to dive in, or from mandating that every household in America be provided an official government Shetland pony. Essentially, jobs and economy as a benefit to government spending on something else means very little. But as a propaganda tool, creating good American jobs seems like an effective political line to break out. Look at this meme for illustration. They should build a big river across America so you can go across it by boat. Building it would create a lot of jobs too. There's a lot of very bad things, in other words, that create jobs. American nuclear dominance is crucial to maintain national security, the safety and non-proliferation of new nuclear plants, and to provide clean energy to America's tech and AI industries, and to create jobs. This leads us to the second major contention: climate change. Daniel Poneman, former Deputy Secretary of Energy under Obama and a heavy hitter in US energy policy, ties the threat of nuclear war to the threat of climate change. Quote, "The existential threat of nuclear annihilation did not go away when the Cold War ended, and now we face a second existential threat from climate change. In the face of these twin threats, American nuclear leadership is as critical in 2019 as it was in 1954. End quote. What promised to destroy mankind may now promise to save us. And we need saving. Global emissions are at a record high, with 37.4 billion tons of CO2 emissions in 2024. And they're still climbing in the US, as increased natural gas use edges out modest reductions from renewables. Because our situation is so dire, a large percent of our energy mix needs to quickly ramp up to carbon-free energy. And only one energy source can produce the massive amounts of carbon-free energy that we need to replace oil. Bowen 20, quote, "Nuclear power has the potential to help stem the advance of climate change. Global greenhouse gas emissions have not yet begun to decline significantly, and in fact have continued to grow in recent years. The world appears to be headed towards 3.9 degrees of warming by the end of the century. With each passing year that emissions continue to grow, deeper and faster cuts will be required in the future to prevent the worst effects of climate change." End quote. The more nuclear we build, the less harsh these climate change impacts will prove to be. And American leadership is vital to this nuclear energy transition. Quote, "American leadership in commercializing advanced nuclear reactors can accelerate international reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, while also revitalizing US exports and maintaining international non-proliferation, security, and safety standards." End quote. So this is a host of benefits that we should welcome alongside the climate change benefits. But how about renewables? Can't we use those instead? Several reasons to prefer nuclear. First, it's always on. It doesn't depend on the sun shining or the wind blowing, so it provides a stable base load for the grid. Second, its large capacity. Renewables just don't produce anywhere near the massive power output of nuclear facilities. Given the graph we saw earlier, where we're only between renewables and nuclear, something like 20% of the total energy production in the US, we need large capacity. That is a requirement for getting off of fossil fuels. Third, nuclear is cheaper. Using nuclear instead of just renewables will cut decarbonization costs by 37%. That's the Washington Post 24. Or there's one number, the evidence up to 50%, although the source is like third hand, so that number is a little bit dubious. You would have to look into that one. Last, history proves that renewables cannot replace nuclear. Conca 19, quote, "Every time nuclear plants close, carbon emissions go up. Using opaque financial jargon, grandiose claims for renewables, and political spin doesn't change this. The build rate for wind and solar is just too low to replace just nuclear, so it would never even get to replacing fossil fuel. And replacing fossil fuel is what the goal of fighting global warming is all about." End quote. Impacts on climate change abound, of course. You can look at the dedicated debate track climate change impact brief for impacts including air pollution, deaths, economy, ecosystem and animals, food production, health, housing, various industries, weather, wildfires, sea rise, and many more. Obviously, climate change isn't great. There are two major contentions for alternative, and those are them, American leadership and climate change. However, before moving on, I'd like to clarify two other points important for this debate. First, why is government involvement necessary to increase nuclear energy? And second, solvency. What exactly might the government pour money into in order to increase the US's nuclear energy industry? Any country with a major nuclear program, including our own, has been state-backed. Given that our strategic adversaries, Russia and China, are competing with large state-backed nuclear industries, our own domestic industry has no chance without federal involvement. The major risk that NPPs face is securing financing. Banks often are hesitant to give out loans that can't be paid back for decades, preferring a shorter return on their investments. The fact that recent nuclear projects have run over budget makes these loans especially risky. But government investment solves. Quote, "Government investment is crucial to facilitate the involvement of commercial banks in financing nuclear power projects by ensuring predictable cash flows and taking on the construction risk." End quote. One of the major issues with pricing nuclear energy is that solar and wind prices are artificially reduced due to government subsidies. A good policy, no doubt, and one we should continue to accelerate our clean energy transition, but one that makes nuclear power seem more expensive than it actually is relative to renewables. Although nuclear gets some funding, solar receives 200 times more subsidies and wind 41 times more subsidies than nuclear. Again, government support solves. Quote, "In recent years, high-efficiency turbines, cheap natural gas, and renewable generation supported by subsidies have driven down wholesale power costs. Nuclear, where costs are largely fixed, has found it difficult to compete. 13 reactors have been closed since 2013, prompting warnings that without intervention, half of the existing fleet would be out of action by the end of the decade. But a concerted push by the federal government to support the sector has stemmed the decline. The bipartisan infrastructure law, passed in 2021, set aside $6 billion to prop up ailing reactors through a civil nuclear credit program." End quote. Although this card, McCormick 23, speaks in generalities, the most specific way the government can support nuclear energy vis-a-vis renewables is by including nuclear energy in these carbon-free subsidy schemes. Stein and Wang et al. 22, quote, "Domestic advanced nuclear energy projects are strongly in the national interest and possess a good case for inclusion in any technology-neutral clean energy subsidy program." End quote. Nuclear subsidies would make a pretty solid AF case. A major incentive for NPPs to get started in the first place is dedicated purchasing contracts. For example, a company might promise to purchase X number of megawatt hours for X number of years at X price, giving investors some financial safety to build the power plant. The US government, as a major energy consumer, is well positioned to be just such a customer. The United States Nuclear Fuel Working Group was established by President Trump in his first term to further investigate nuclear development. Here's the World Nuclear Association 24, quote, "The working group recommends using the purchasing power of the federal government to spur demand. The federal government is a major purchaser of domestic power generation. The purchasing power of U.S. departments and agencies, in particular the Department of Defense, is an important component for sustaining a baseline of U.S. nuclear power generation." End quote. Finally, cost overruns. Although serial development and standardized designs can significantly reduce the cost of nuclear energy, cost overruns are still expected from nuclear power plants in the short term. The federal government can help to get the domestic nuclear industry back on its feet by covering the risk of these overruns. Quote, "The most impactful government action to accelerate commitments to clean, firm nuclear energy would be government funding to enable the completion of projects that incur unanticipated costs. Cost uncertainty is one of the principal factors inhibiting commitments to advance nuclear energy projects." End quote. All right, so that is essentially why the government is needed. Next section is solvency. And we have already talked about a number of monetary solvencies. That's actually probably what the past section should have been called, is just fiscal solvency. So these are things the government can actually do to support the HAF plan, to support the nuclear power industry: financing, subsidies, energy purchases, and ensuring cost overruns. Those are four really solid ways the US can actually throw money at the problem. This section will focus on several technological or engineering applications of government investment. So this section isn't strictly necessary to win debates, but it provides a number of concrete examples that can illustrate to judges where the US is lacking and where federal money might flow to adequately address our nuclear energy shortcomings. First, plant preservation. Although the US has the world's largest nuclear fleet, it's quickly aging, and many power plants are at various stages of decommissioning, and others prematurely brought offline due to competition from heavily subsidized renewable energy and cheap but dirty coal and gas plants. Government investment can help to preserve our existing nuclear fleet. Johnson 19, quote, "A middle path between new plants and no plants is lifetime extensions for existing reactors. The cost for maintenance and improvements needed to continue operating an existing nuclear reactor for an additional 10 to 20 years would be 500 million to 1.1 billion per gigawatt, an amount the IEA says is comparable to constructing a renewable solar or wind system of the same size." One impact is cost. According to Conca 19, operating existing nuclear facilities is the cheapest cost of any energy source. Quote, "Operating an existing nuclear plant is much more cost effective than even existing coal and gas plants, and much cheaper than installing any new power plant, even natural gas." End quote. So, restoring these aging nuclear power plants to the point where they can continue operating for another decade or two could be a cost-effective path forward. Despite this, some plants have been outcompeted by cheap natural gas, which can be quickly switched on and off to meet demand, thus outcompeting the short-term, immediate prices that our unregulated energy markets compete on. Preserving these plants is a large boon for carbon emissions and the climate. Closing one nuclear plant increases carbon emissions by 5.8 million metric tons per year. That's the equivalent of adding 1.2 million cars to the road each time a nuclear power plant closes. Second, solvency. Second place for the government to put its money into: uranium. The largest uranium reserves in the world are found in Australia, Kazakhstan, and Canada. The US has already mined about 3/4 of its known reserves and now mines very little. In fact, only 0.1% of its existing uranium was mined in 2020. This isn't an issue per se, as remaining reserves in the US are generally lower grade, harder to access, and generally far more expensive than importing from Canada or Kazakhstan. What's more troubling is processing. As we've said before, Russia controls 40% of the uranium conversion market and 100% of the HALEU fuel production needed for SMRs. Although by some kind of presidential decree, Russia is no longer our enemy, in geopolitical, historical, practical terms, not much has changed. Over-reliance on Russia for anything crucial, and especially for uranium production, is a danger to the US's nuclear energy chain and a smart idea for government investment to go into. Last, innovation. As we mentioned, 4th-gen reactors offer a host of benefits over 3rd-gen reactors, yet very few are operational around the world, and 0 are being produced in the US. Government investment can bring us closer to the future of nuclear tech and ensure that that future remains in the US. Or ensure that that future travels from China, where it currently is, to the US. Advanced reactors in the literature typically mean SMRs, Although there are a great many innovative technologies available in the future, SMRs are the closest to production-ready 4th-gen nuclear technology, and the most appealing in terms of investment. As we mentioned, SMRs theoretically solve size, cost, safety, proliferation, at least safety, maybe not proliferation. However, SMR projects are financially risky and require special financing. These projects are still in various stages of development, testing, and experimentation, and are still not at the level of large-scale manufacturing needed to significantly reduce costs. But yet again, the government solves. We have several sources here talking about how government investment will bring SMRs online. I'll quote from Stein and Wong et al. 22, talking about the many tools the federal government has to encourage nuclear innovation. Quote, to encourage capital investments into U.S. advanced nuclear projects and to reduce nuclear project costs, federal programs can guarantee repayment of loans for advanced nuclear projects. Such federal loan guarantees can thus play a highly influential role in accelerating the domestic development of an advanced nuclear reactor. Nuclear power plants should benefit from federal tax incentives intended to accelerate national clean power generation. Such federal tax incentives will further improve the economics of new advanced nuclear projects. End quote. One impact of advanced reactors is electricity, of course, the same as in 2nd and 3rd gen systems, but because advanced reactors operate at higher temperatures, the process heat generated can also be used for desalination, hydrogen production, and industry. SMRs specifically can be used to power remote communities where stable, clean energy is otherwise unavailable. Now, if SMRs represent the short-term hope for massively scaling nuclear, fusion represents the medium and long-term hope. While SMRs massively contain the risks of nuclear waste, proliferation, cost, and fuel availability, fusion, if developed into a mature technology, would completely eliminate these risks. Despite huge progress in recent years, however, there are still major technological impediments to using fusion for electricity, including net energy generation for the entire process, developing heat-resistant materials, and turning the energy produced in the reaction into usable electricity. Bowen 23 argues, therefore, that the government should be involved in making fusion happen. Quote, fusion-based energy is inherently safer than existing fission-based plants. It does not produce the same type of long-lived nuclear waste that requires deep geological isolation and presents less of a nuclear proliferation concern. A 2021 U.S. National Academy report recommended that for the U.S. to be a leader in fusion and contribute to mid-century decarbonization, DOE should produce a fusion pilot plant in the United States. End quote. While this government investment may not pay off for several decades, once developed, fusion would solve long-term energy needs, say in the back half of the century and beyond, when massive energy needs will continue to accelerate and the worst effects of climate change will be proverbially slapping us in the face. Finally, research of all kinds might be funded by the government to improve nuclear technologies, like accident-tolerant fuels, uranium extraction technologies, wastewater disposal programs, and probably dozens of other technological and engineering challenges that I couldn't even begin to understand, but that would play well in as a not-so-obvious affirmative case. I imagine if a nuclear engineer were watching this, they would be able to give you, 17 different components and processes and parts that could be massively improved in the process to improve energy production, safety, etc. These are all obviously areas that I don't know about that the government money could flow into. So as you see, tons and tons of material for affirmative to choose from for coming up with contentions and cases. In fact, this may turn out to be one of the longest lectures I've done. Definitely on the long side. Now, negative. Although the arguments presented here seem less strong than affirmatives, remember that from a technical standpoint, neg only needs to win on a single DA plus solid defense to win rounds. Also remember that if you are in a lay round on neg, you may as well just give up early and take an extended lunch. Just kidding. Okay, let's start with the most obvious argument, cost. The biggest cost of nuclear power is the massive upfront price tag. NPPs cost between $5 and $10 billion. For comparison, a comparably sized solar plant in Abu Dhabi, the 1.2 gigawatt Noor Abu Dhabi solar plant, costs less than $1 billion. Cooper Mountain, the US's largest solar farm, totals 800 megawatts. Again, the same size as a mid-sized nuclear facility, and costs $1.5 billion total for construction. Or take the Hoover Dam, also constructed for under $1 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars with a 2 gigawatt capacity, or double the size of the average nuclear plant. So, when you're comparing to anything else, nuclear is crazy expensive. But it's not just upfront cost. The LCO, or levied cost of energy, accounts for lifetime costs, including construction, maintenance, and operation. According to this measure, nuclear is at least 5 times more expensive than renewables. All this means that nuclear isn't a competitively priced source of energy, especially with better options available. Kemp 25, quote, "Nuclear remains expensive, and its costs likely outweighs the benefits as a zero-carbon energy resource. R&D funding, tax credits, favorable loans, and subsidies don't alter the intrinsic cost of nuclear. They simply transfer a portion of these costs to taxpayers. If the calculus of nuclear makes sense to Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, they should take on the risk without taxpayers footing part of the bill. The benefits of zero-carbon electricity is vastly outweighed by the astronomical cost of construction. It would require a substantial reduction in these costs before nuclear is economical, even when accounting for climate change damages." End quote. Now, I should note that I am trying my best to paint nuclear in the best light possible. I want to steelman the opposition here. As you can see, though, even this charitable view of nuclear shows it's impossible to further justify any kind of investment. But it actually gets worse. Recent US projects have been plagued by cost overruns and corruption, according to reporting from the Washington Post 24. The most recent Vogtle reactor came in $20 billion over budget and 7 years late. $20 billion over budget. This is again in a market where an expensive nuclear reactor should cost about $10 billion. And this isn't a one-off incident. Quote, "The misfortune at Vogtle was overshadowed only by the calamity that befell another power company across the state line in South Carolina that was building its own Westinghouse AP1000 reactor, the same design used at Vogtle. South Carolina utility SCANA burned through $9 billion before scrapping the project altogether. Federal prosecutors in 2020 would declare that project a cauldron of fraud." Yet another massive monetary cost is nuclear waste. Waste disposal should be figured into the enormous cost of nuclear, especially when considering future generations who will have to deal with it. Yet when calculating monetary costs, it is rarely figured into the final prices. Nuclear plants also take a very long time to build. Large-scale projects, the ones that might make an impact, take between 10 and 15 years to build. And again, that is without the massive time overruns that are characteristic of these projects. What this means is that if we're looking to solve a problem that app presents, we're looking at starting to solve the problem in a decade, and that is the best case scenario, which again, given schedule overruns that are again just characteristic of American construction projects, is itself a pipe dream. So here's the question we have to ask ourselves. Do we have time to sit on our hands and pour money into corrupt systems as a way to address climate change? Do we have time to charge taxpayers exorbitant billions of dollars while getting nothing in return on projects that we know to be corrupt in order to better compete with China? Why don't we just throw our money into a big pit to compete with China? Throw our money into a big pit to address climate change? So, this factor of time alone removes the potency from any serious arguments that affirmative might present. The alternative, of course, is renewables, which is the third cost, opportunity costs. Inasmuch as nuclear distracts from renewable energy production, it represents an opportunity cost. You can only spend a single government dollar on a single thing, and every dollar that goes to nuclear doesn't go to quick, proven, and popular renewable energy projects that should be sprouting up across America. Johnson 19, quote, "Over-reliance on nuclear might in fact stall development and installation of technologies needed for a transition to a low-carbon future." End quote. Another source we'll hear from a little bit later says we should shut down nuclear plants. Pave the way for renewables. Let them bloom. Now DAs. Nuclear power brings not just a neutral state of bloated, expensive, and decades-long life timelines. It's not just throwing our money into a pit, right? Which would just be neutral, except we'd be poorer. There are real disadvantages to accelerating nuclear energy development. The first is waste. Nuclear waste remains toxic and deadly for up to hundreds of thousands of years, and every nuclear facility generates a steady stream of radioactive material. What's worse, we have nowhere to put it. Jacoby 20, quote, "Waste can remain dangerously radioactive for many thousands of years. For now, waste accumulates mainly where it's generated, at the power plants and processing facilities. Some of it has been sitting in interim storage since the 1940s. During World War II and throughout the Cold War era, the US generated millions of liters of this toxic sludge. In Hanford alone, more than 200 million liters of this waste sits after many decades in underground tanks waiting to be processed. About 1/3 of the nearly 180 storage tanks, many of which long ago outlived their design lives, are known to be leaking." End quote. This means that as we continue to operate and build out nuclear capability, the waste just keeps accumulating. Rising sea levels further complicate nuclear waste management. You'll recall that because nuclear plants require water for cooling, they're often built near oceans, where they have ready access to near unlimited cold water. That means the waste stored on site is essentially stored at the shoreline. Here's Salmon 19. "Rising sea levels are also a problem for the ever-perplexing, still unresolved issue of waste disposal. Sea level rise threatens waste disposal, and with no way to check for leaks, the impact of rising seas on that waste remains largely unknown." End quote. So in summary, nuclear waste, radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years and dangerous for tens of thousands, is stored in leaking containers near the water, which we have no way to check for leaks on these containers, and we have no place to put them. And the affirmative team wants more of this. Safety is another large concern. The US has robust safety measures in place for its nuclear facilities, but these safeguards are in danger of being stripped away by new nuclear companies aiming to cut costs with the promise of being safe. Again, for context, these reactors are unbuilt and unproven. Not exactly the kind of reactor you'd hope would be free from burdensome, pesky safety regulations. Cho 19, speaking of SMRs made by the company NuScale, quote, "Designers want to dramatically change how nuclear plants are organized and run. Under NRC regulations, a control room can operate no more than 2 reactors. NuScale wants permission to run a dozen of their reactors from such a control room. The company has asked NRC to eliminate a requirement for backup electrical power. Similarly, NuScale wants to avoid a requirement for an emergency evacuation zone 32 kilometers wide, arguing its reactors pose no risk of spreading radiation." End quote. Just like the Titanic posed no risk of sinking. Do we really need more lessons in hubris? Now, you would imagine that companies like this would have a large incentive to not cause nuclear accidents because, of course, they would have to pay for them, right? But in fact, they don't, because they wouldn't. Recent rulings based on the Price-Anderson Act give companies widespread indemnification, immunity from liability for nuclear accidents. Quote, Daniel et al. 25, "With new executive orders directing the slashing of red tape for the nuclear industry, a new legal precedent from the federal circuit dramatically broadening government-backed indemnification for all steps of the nuclear fuel cycle, DOE contractor indemnification accrues for legal claims arising out of nuclear accidents. The definition of nuclear incident extends to occurrences resulting from the radioactive, toxic, explosive, or other hazardous properties of source special material or byproduct material." End quote. So when AF talks about increasing investments, this is the modern regulatory framework that this investment would pour into. A legal situation where companies are not responsible and don't want to prevent nuclear accidents. If that's not enough, environmental damage. While nuclear power claims to be zero carbon, it's really an open question as to whether it's even low carbon. Johnson 19 and Salmon 19 both talk about this. I'll quote from, let's do Salmon 19, quote, "The process of getting to that energy generation complicates nuclear's claim to zero carbon status. Uranium mining, processing, and transport are all carbon-intensive procedures done by diesel-powered heavy machinery. Instead of carbon, the plants themselves emit heat, often in great quantities, which can warm nearby air and water dramatically, killing fish and wildlife and afflicting neighboring habitats." End quote. So look, I'm not saying that burning coal is better, but I am saying that we should be skeptical of an AF team that pretends to have a green heart, who wants to expand nuclear power for the sake of the environment, and not for other, more nefarious reasons. Who exactly are you working for, AF? Last major DA is proliferation. Because there's technological overlap between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, namely uranium enrichment, proliferation is a major concern in building out more nuclear capability. Although a domestic build-out might not lead directly to nuclear weapons, there are indirect links through exports, especially if AF hopes that the US become a leader in exporting these technologies, or gain some kind of political edge through their exports. SMRs are an especially likely proliferation vector. Carlos 20, quote, "The emerging prospect of small modular reactors promises additional proliferation risks. Such reactors have the benefit of flexible siting, but this also means they can be located in remote locations where safeguards are difficult to enforce, and the risk that reactor fuel can be diverted from peaceful to military purposes or to non-state actors rises substantially," end quote. Domestically, nuclear terrorism is another risk to consider. The more nuclear investment, the more nuclear plants, the more nuclear material around, the more chances for any bad actors to take advantage of this increased investment. Now, I don't have any cards cut on proliferation or terrorism, except for the SMR disadvantage, because I don't think there's much credence to the ideas, and I try to keep you all more or less on the right path with the briefs. However, there is a near 100% chance that some debaters will run proliferation and/or terrorism, and to be fair, they're easy to throw in as time sinks, so I thought I would mention them here. In this final section, I'll discuss arguments against AF's stance on 4 words of the resolution: U.S. federal government, increase, investment, and nuclear energy. AF must defend all 4, while we must only win 1, technically speaking, to win a debate round on the flow. AF wants to spend billions of taxpayer dollars on nuclear projects. But if nuclear really is the reliable, high-capacity energy savior AF promises, private investors should be happy to foot the bill. McCormick 23, quote, "Private funds are flowing rapidly into the sector. The Nuclear Energy Institute estimates that more than $5 billion in private investment has been pumped into advanced nuclear companies globally over the past 12 months alone," end quote. A huge part of this investment is, as we mentioned before, the tech sector, with AWS, Microsoft, and Google all showing interest in nuclear-powered data centers. It seems from these cards that the private market is doing the lifting. Why does the government need to be involved? Second, investment. Many of the sources in the literature point toward government investment as key, or at least helpful, to developing the nuclear industry. Relatively few of them point to monetary investments as the mechanism. More often, changing regulations and laws and establishing frameworks and working groups are cited as the best ways to help a nuclear America. Nuclear Energy Agency 25, quote, "Given the scale of the infrastructure investment required, the rollout of new nuclear projects cannot rely exclusively on public finances. To take advantage of the opportunities that nuclear power offers, governments must be prepared to provide the strategic vision alongside stable regulatory frameworks that will give the private sector confidence to invest," end quote. So, government can play a role without paying out valuable taxpayer dollars by the billions. And nuclear, a big word we should contend with. Perhaps the US federal government should invest money in domestic energy, but as we've seen, renewables have too many benefits over nuclear for nuclear to make any sense. Renewables have grown to surpass nuclear, and they are still growing. Whatever benefits nuclear touts, renewables, plus a healthy battery grid, can do the same, faster and cheaper. In fact, Salmon 19 argues for shutting nuclear plants down to pave the way for a faster renewable revolution. Quote, "Countries that have chosen to decommission slowly have seen their renewable build-out stymied accordingly. Dependence on nuclear has decelerated an inevitable process. Sweden's reliance on nuclear has been an impediment to renewable development, which is part of the reason the deadline for decommissioning keeps getting pushed," end quote. Lastly, increase. The US federal government already invests billions in nuclear energy. In fact, $40 billion will be invested in the next decade, according to McCormick 23. That's enough for 4 new 1 gigawatt plants. By modern American standards, an unprecedented increase. Although, given our track record of cost overruns, maybe it would only be 1 plant. In any case, given this planned outlay, $40 billion over the next decade, it's incumbent on the affirmative team to say why a significant increase from this number is a good plan. A hard thing to do indeed. Now, that wraps up this lecture. Thank you for watching. Please make your way to debatetrack.com and pick up the evidence brief that corresponds to this lecture. Your support means the world to me. And if you won't do that, at least leave me a like and a comment for the algorithm, or send me an email with your job leads for front-end developer jobs. Remember to be kind to yourself and to the people around you. See you all in 2 months for the national topic. Until then.